On the morning of December 19th, 1944, Oberleutnant Franz Bäke stood beside his disabled Panther tank 3 kilometers east of Bastogne, watching an endless column of American Sherman tanks roll past his position through the frozen Belgian countryside. Bäke commanded a platoon in the Panzer Lehr Division, Germany's elite armored demonstration unit. He had fought in Poland, France, and across the Russian steppes. He knew tanks, he knew warfare. He understood what numbers meant on a battlefield, but what he was witnessing made no tactical sense. The Americans had lost hundreds of tanks during the past 3 days of fighting. Bäke's unit alone had destroyed 23 Shermans in the opening phase of the Ardennes offensive. Yet here they came, wave after wave, as if the losses meant nothing, as if the Americans could simply conjure new tanks from thin air. Bäke pulled a small notebook from his coat and began counting. 30 tanks passed, then 50, then 75. The column continued for over an hour. By the time the last Sherman disappeared into the tree line heading north toward Bastogne, Bäke had counted 142 American tanks moving in a single formation. The mathematics troubled him more than the cold. German intelligence had estimated American tank strength in the European theatre at approximately 2,500 operational vehicles as of December 1944. If that estimate was correct, Bäke had just watched nearly 6% of America's entire tank force in Europe pass through one small sector of the front. But he knew American tanks were fighting simultaneously in Italy, in eastern France, in the Netherlands, and across dozens of other locations. The numbers did not work. Either German intelligence was catastrophically wrong, or the Americans had discovered some way to produce armoured vehicles at a rate no military planner thought possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. It was December of 1944. Germany's last major offensive in the West had begun 3 days earlier, with over 400,000 men and 1,400 tanks crashing through the Ardennes forest. The attack achieved complete surprise. American units retreated in confusion. German spearheads drove deep into Allied lines. For 72 hours, it looked like Germany might split the Allied armies and turn the tide of the war. Then the Americans started arriving with tanks. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. From every direction, American armored columns converged on the battle. The Third Army turned 90 degrees from its positions in eastern France and attacked north with over 600 tanks. The First Army shifted units from defensive positions along the German border and counterattacked with another 800 tanks. British armoured brigades moved south from Holland with hundreds more. Within a week, the German offensive stalled under the weight of armoured formations that seemed to materialise from nowhere. By early January 1945, American forces had deployed 9 complete armoured divisions to the Ardennes sector, along with 17 separate tank battalions and 25 tank destroyer battalions. The Americans had over 10,000 tanks and armoured fighting vehicles concentrated in a sector of front that measured less than 75 miles wide. 10,000 tanks, in one small corner of Western Europe, while simultaneously maintaining major armoured formations in Italy, preparing for operations along the Rhine, and keeping reserve forces in England and France. The scale was incomprehensible to German commanders who had spent the past year watching their own tank forces dwindle through attrition and production failures. The question that haunted Bäke and every other German officer that winter was simple. Where were all these American tanks coming from? In Berlin, German military intelligence maintained detailed files on American industrial capacity. Those files contained accurate information about American steel production, automotive manufacturing capability, and machine tool capacity. German analysts had studied American factories. They understood American logistics. They had even obtained copies of American military production contracts through various intelligence sources. The problem was not missing information. The problem was that German analysts looked at American industrial capacity through a German lens and reached German conclusions. They made assumptions about how tank production worked based on German experience, and those assumptions were completely wrong. In 1939, The United States Army possessed exactly 15 medium tanks total. The entire American tank fleet consisted of fewer than 400 obsolete light tanks armed with machine guns. America was not a tank power. It had no modern armor doctrine, no experienced tank crews, no infrastructure for armored warfare. Germany, by contrast, had built its entire military strategy around armored operations. German factories had produced thousands of tanks during the 1930s. German doctrine emphasized quality, engineering precision, and technical sophistication. Each German tank was a carefully crafted piece of military equipment built by skilled workers using specialized tools. German military intelligence officers, analyzing American tank potential in 1940, made a reasonable calculation. They examined American industrial output, noted that America had never built tanks in significant numbers, and concluded that American tank production would follow patterns similar to German production. Skilled craftsmen would build tanks one at a time, using precise tolerances and quality materials. Production would be limited by the availability of trained workers, specialized tools, and complex components. Based on German production rates and German manufacturing methods, analysts estimated America could build perhaps 500 to 800 tanks per month under optimal wartime conditions. That would give the Americans maybe 10,000 tanks per year if they fully mobilized their industry and solved all the engineering and logistics problems involved in tank manufacture. The estimate seemed generous. Germany itself was only producing around 1,200 tanks and assault guns per month in 1942, despite having years of experience and purpose-built tank factories. How could America, starting from essentially zero, match or exceed German output? The answer was that American industry did not build tanks the way Germans built tanks. The Americans were not going to hire craftsmen and set up specialized workshops. They were going to mass-produce armored vehicles the same way they mass-produced automobiles, tractors, and refrigerators. They were going to apply assembly line techniques developed over 30 years in civilian industry to military production. They were going to build tanks the way Henry Ford built Model T automobiles. The Germans knew about American automotive production. They understood assembly line methods, but they did not believe those methods could work for complex military equipment like tanks. Automobiles were simple machines with loose tolerances. A car that was slightly off specification still functioned adequately. Tanks required precision. The armor had to be properly hardened. The transmission had to handle enormous torque loads. The suspension had to support 20 to 30 tons moving across rough terrain. The turret traverse had to be smooth and reliable. The gun had to maintain accuracy after thousands of rounds. These were not problems that could be solved with simple assembly line production. These required German engineering discipline, German quality control, German technical expertise. Or so German analysts believed. On August 28, 1940, while France was still recovering from defeat and Britain stood alone against Germany, the United States Army awarded a contract to Chrysler Corporation for 1,000 M3 medium tanks. The contract was notable for two reasons. First, it was the largest tank order in American history by a factor of 20. Second, Chrysler had never built a tank before. The company made automobiles and trucks. Now it would build 30-ton armored vehicles mounting 75mm cannons. Chrysler executives accepted the contract on one condition. They would build a completely new factory specifically designed for tank production. They would not try to convert existing automobile plants. They would design the facility from the ground up as a tank factory using mass production principles. Construction began on the Detroit Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, in January 1941. The site covered 113 acres. The main building would be one of the largest enclosed factories in the world, with over 40 acres of floor space under a single roof. The facility would include its own power plant, its own railroad connections, its own testing grounds. The scale of the project stunned German observers. American newspapers published photographs and articles about the tank arsenal. German intelligence officers read these reports with skeptical interest. The Americans were building one very large factory. That was impressive, But one factory, however large, could only produce a limited number of tanks. The bottleneck would be the availability of skilled workers, specialized components, and quality materials. Building a big factory did not solve those fundamental constraints. The first M3 medium tank rolled out of the Detroit tank arsenal in April 1941. Production that month totaled 10 tanks. In May, 25 tanks. In June, 42 tanks. The output increased steadily as workers learned their jobs and production processes improved. By the end of 1941, the arsenal was producing over 100 tanks per month. This was respectable by European standards. Germany's best tank factories were producing similar numbers. But German analysts noted that Chrysler had taken 8 months to reach full production capacity. Scaling up tank production was slow and difficult, exactly as predicted. The Americans would face the same constraints Germany faced. They would need years to build enough factories, train enough workers, and solve enough technical problems to become a major tank producer. Then, in 1942, something unexpected happened. American tank production did not increase linearly. It exploded. The Detroit tank arsenal reached 200 tanks per month, then 300, then 400. By the end of 1942, the facility was producing over 600 tanks per month from a single factory complex. But Detroit was no longer the only American tank plant. In 1942, 11 different American factories were producing tanks and armored vehicles. These included traditional military contractors, but also companies that had never built military equipment before. General Motors converted truck plants. Ford opened new facilities. Chrysler expanded beyond Detroit. Each new factory followed the same pattern. Initial production started slowly. Within 6 to 12 months, output reached levels comparable to Germany's best facilities. The Americans were not just building tanks, they were building tank factories, and each factory was designed from the beginning for mass production using assembly line methods. The total American tank production in 1942 reached 26,394 tanks and armored fighting vehicles. That was more than double what German intelligence had estimated as America's maximum annual capacity, and it was just the beginning. In 1943, American production reached 37,188 tanks and armored vehicles. The Americans were now producing more tanks than Germany could build, even at peak wartime mobilization, and American production was still increasing. German intelligence officers reviewing these numbers in late 1943 faced an uncomfortable reality. Their pre-war estimates of American tank production capacity had been wrong by a factor of 4 to 1. America was not building 500 to 800 tanks per month. America was building over 3,000 tanks per month, and the production rate was still climbing. The error was not a simple miscalculation. It was a fundamental failure to understand how American industry functioned. German analysts had assumed American tank production would look like German tank production because they could not imagine any other way to build complex military equipment. They had decades of experience with craft-based manufacturing, where skilled workers assembled tanks one at a time using precision tools. That was how tanks were built. That was how they had to be built. The Americans proved them wrong. American factories did not build tanks one at a time. They built them on moving assembly lines with work broken into simple, repetitive tasks performed by semi-skilled workers. A worker did not need to understand how an entire tank functioned. They needed to know how to install one specific component. The next worker down the line installed the next component, and so on, through hundreds of sequential operations. The key insight was that complexity could be managed through simplification and standardization. Make every part identical. Design fixtures and jigs that ensured parts fit together correctly every time. Break assembly into small, manageable steps. Train workers to perform those specific steps efficiently. Move the product past the workers instead of having workers move around the product. Keep the line moving continuously. These were the principles that had transformed American automobile manufacturing in the 1920s. Now they were being applied to tanks. And they worked. Consider the M4 Sherman tank, which became the primary American medium tank from 1942 onward. The Sherman had approximately 20,000 individual parts. In a traditional manufacturing approach, skilled workers would custom fit many of those parts, drilling holes and making adjustments to ensure everything aligned properly. Each tank would be slightly different because each was hand-built. American factories did not work that way. Every Sherman part was manufactured to precise specifications on machines that produced identical components. The front hull armor was stamped out on massive presses that produced hundreds of identical pieces. The transmission was built on a separate assembly line that turned out complete transmissions at a rate of dozens per day. The suspension components were manufactured in batches of thousands. The engines came from specialized engine plants. All these components flowed to final assembly lines where they were installed in sequence. No custom fitting required, no hand drilling, no making adjustments. The parts either fit or they did not fit, and if they did not fit, it meant the tooling was wrong and needed to be corrected. Once the tooling was right, every part fit perfectly every time. This approach required enormous upfront investment in tooling and factory layout. The Detroit tank arsenal spent $20 million on machine tools and production equipment before building its first tank. But once the investment was made, the factory could produce tanks at a rate that craft-based methods could never match. The difference in productivity was staggering. German tank factories employed skilled mechanics who had trained for years. American tank factories employed workers who had received a few weeks of training. Yet the American workers produced more tanks because the production system did not rely on individual skill. It relied on standardization, specialization, and continuous flow. A German Panther tank required approximately 300,000 man-hours to build. An American Sherman required approximately 10,000 man-hours. The Panther was a superior tank in many respects, with better armor and a more powerful gun. But Germany could build one Panther in the time America could build 30 Shermans. In industrial warfare, 30 against 1 matters more than individual vehicle superiority, and this was the calculation German planners had missed. They had looked at American industrial capacity and asked how many tanks of German quality America could build. They should have asked how many tanks America could build if Americans applied their own industrial methods instead of copying German approaches. The M4 Sherman was designed specifically for mass production. The initial design work emphasized simplicity and standardization. Engineers deliberately chose components that could be manufactured easily. The hull was made from simple rolled armor plate that could be cut and welded quickly. The suspension used relatively simple vertical volute springs instead of more complex torsion bars. The transmission was adapted from existing automotive designs rather than being custom engineered for tank use. These design choices made the Sherman easier to build, easier to maintain, and easier to repair. They also made it less sophisticated than German tanks. The Sherman's armor was adequate, but not exceptional. Its 75mm gun was effective against most targets, but struggled against late-war German heavy tanks. Its suspension provided reasonable cross-country mobility, but was not as refined as German systems. German tankers who encountered Shermans in combat often praised their own vehicles as superior. And they were right, in a narrow technical sense. A single Panther could destroy multiple Shermans in a direct engagement, but there were always more Shermans. Always. No matter how many were destroyed, more appeared. By mid-1944, American factories were producing over 49,000 Shermans. The Detroit tank arsenal alone had built over 17,000 M4 tanks of various models. Chrysler's tank production represented 36% of all Sherman production, and Chrysler was only one of several major manufacturers. Total American tank and armored vehicle production, from 1940 through 1945, exceeded 97,000 units. This included 29,000 medium tanks, 24,000 light tanks, and thousands of specialized vehicles, like tank destroyers, armored cars, and self-propelled artillery. Germany produced approximately 30,000 tanks and assault guns during the same period. Even when combined with Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian production, The Axis powers built fewer than 40,000 armored vehicles during the entire war. America alone outproduced the entire Axis by more than 2 to 1. The Soviet Union produced over 63,000 tanks during the war, making it the largest tank producer among all combatants. But the Soviets were fighting a single-front war that demanded every tank they could build for immediate deployment to the Eastern Front. America was fighting a multi-theater war and still outproduced Germany by a factor of 3 to 1, while simultaneously building thousands of aircraft, hundreds of ships, and millions of tons of other military equipment. The scale of American production became clear to German commanders during major operations in 1944. After D-Day in June, American armored divisions rolled through France with Sherman tanks that were replaced faster than they could be destroyed. Tank battalions that lost dozens of vehicles in combat were back to full strength, within weeks, sometimes days. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 demonstrated American production supremacy in brutal clarity. Germany committed virtually every available tank to the offensive, scraping together 1,400 armored vehicles from across the entire Western Front. This represented months of production and careful husbandry of limited resources. The Americans responded by deploying 10,000 tanks to the battle sector in a matter of weeks. They pulled armored divisions from other areas, activated reserve units, and shipped freshly produced tanks directly from American factories to European ports. The Third Army alone moved over 600 tanks 90 degrees from its axis of advance and attacked the southern flank of the German penetration. This kind of strategic mobility and material abundance was only possible because America had an effectively unlimited supply of armored vehicles. German tank commanders watching this unfold understood that the war was lost, not because of tactical failures or strategic mistakes, but because of simple mathematics. Germany could not match American production. Every tank Germany lost was essentially irreplaceable. Every tank America lost was replaced within a week by 3 more. The Battle of the Bulge destroyed German armored forces in the West. Germany lost approximately 700 tanks that could not be replaced. By early February 1945, the entire Western Front had only 190 tanks, 533 assault guns, and 87 tank destroyers operational. These faced thousands of American and British tanks advancing toward the Rhine and into Germany itself. The production numbers told the story of defeat. In January 1945, Germany produced 631 tanks and assault guns. That same month, American factories built over 2,000 tanks. In February, German production dropped to 463 vehicles. America produced another 2,000. By March, German industry was collapsing under Allied bombing and fuel shortages. America just kept building tanks. The final American tank production totals for World War II were staggering in their scale and implications. 97,000 tanks and armored vehicles from 1940 through 1945. That was more than the combined production of Germany, Italy, Japan, and all their allies combined. And it did not include the thousands of additional vehicles built for Allied nations under Lend-Lease. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Oberleutnant Bäke survived the Battle of the Bulge. His Panther was recovered and repaired. He fought through the retreat across Germany until his unit surrendered in April 1945. After the war, he was interviewed by American historical officers who were documenting German perspectives on Allied industrial capacity. The interview transcript records a remarkable conversation. The Americans asked Bäke about German intelligence estimates of American tank strength. Bäke explained that German intelligence had initially estimated American tank production at approximately 600 per month. The Americans then showed him the actual production figures, over 3,000 per month at peak output. Bäke's response was documented in the official record. That cannot be correct. No nation can build 3,000 tanks in 1 month. That is more than we built in an entire year. You are telling me America built more tanks in 4 months than Germany built during the entire war. The American officer confirmed the numbers were accurate. Bäke sat silently for several minutes before responding. "Then we never had any chance. We were fighting arithmetic." He was exactly right. The Ardennes offensive failed, not because of tactical mistakes or strategic miscalculations. It failed because Germany could not match American industrial production, and German intelligence had failed to understand American production capacity until it was far too late to matter. The intelligence failure was not about missing information. German analysts had access to public information about American factories, American steel production, American automotive capacity. The information was available in newspapers, trade journals, and published statistics. The failure was conceptual. German analysts could not imagine tank production working differently than German tank production. They assumed complexity required craft production methods. They assumed quality required skilled craftsmen. They assumed standardization was impossible for military equipment with tight tolerances and demanding specifications. Every assumption was wrong. American industry proved that complex military equipment could be mass-produced using assembly line methods. Quality came from superior tooling and process control, not from individual craftsmanship. Standardization was not only possible, but essential for achieving high production rates. The German intelligence failure regarding American tank production was a specific example of a broader pattern. Throughout the war, German intelligence consistently underestimated American industrial capacity across every category of military equipment: aircraft production, ship construction, ammunition manufacturing. In every case, German estimates were wrong by factors of 3 to 5 times actual American output. The pattern suggests a systematic flaw in German intelligence analysis. German analysts looked at American society and saw a consumer economy with limited military-industrial base. They saw workers who were accustomed to comfortable lives and assumed those workers could not match German discipline and dedication. They saw American factories producing refrigerators and automobiles and assumed those factories could not be converted to military production at scale. They failed to understand that American industrial capacity was far more flexible and scalable than German industry. American factories could be converted rapidly because American manufacturing relied on standardized tools, interchangeable parts, and process-driven production rather than craft-based methods. American workers could be trained quickly because the production systems did not require extensive individual skill. Most importantly, American industry had enormous excess capacity. During the Depression years of the 1930s, American factories had operated well below capacity. Millions of workers were unemployed. Industrial plants sat idle. When war mobilization began, that excess capacity became available immediately. Germany had no comparable reserve. German industry had been operating at high capacity throughout the 1930s to support rearmament. When war began, German factories were already working, at or near their maximum output. Increasing production meant building new facilities, training new workers, and competing for limited resources across multiple production programs. America simply turned on dormant factories and hired unemployed workers. Within months, American industrial output doubled. Within 2 years, it had increased 5-fold. Germany watched this expansion with growing alarm and disbelief. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, later wrote that German leaders had dismissed early intelligence reports about American production as propaganda. When reports indicated America had produced over 20,000 tanks in 1942, Hitler personally rejected the figure as impossible. He ordered intelligence officers to provide more realistic estimates based on Germany's own production experience. The revised estimates were lower, more in line with German assumptions about what was possible in tank manufacturing. They were also completely wrong. And German strategic planning proceeded on the basis of incorrect assumptions about American industrial weakness that bore no relationship to reality. The consequences of this intelligence failure extended far beyond tanks. If German intelligence had accurately assessed American production capacity in 1940 or 1941, German strategic planning might have been fundamentally different. The decision to declare war on the United States in December 1941 might have been reconsidered. The assumption that Germany could win a war of attrition against the Allies would have been abandoned. But accurate intelligence requires the ability to accept uncomfortable truths that contradict assumptions and preferences. German intelligence analysis during World War II was not designed to challenge fundamental assumptions. It was designed to provide information that supported existing strategic decisions. When intelligence officers reported American industrial capacity that seemed impossibly large, those reports were rejected as unreliable. When captured American documents showed production figures that contradicted German estimates, the documents were assumed to be falsified. When German officers in prisoner of war camps were questioned about American production and confirmed the numbers were real, their testimony was discounted as unreliable hearsay. The institutional bias toward confirming existing beliefs meant that German intelligence could not fulfill its actual function, providing accurate information about enemy capabilities, even when that information was unwelcome. And this failure contributed directly to Germany's defeat. The story of American tank production during World War II is ultimately a story about industrial mobilization and the power of mass production methods. But it is also a story about intelligence failure and the dangers of mirror imaging, assuming the enemy operates the same way you do and will face the same constraints you face. German intelligence officers were intelligent, experienced professionals. They had extensive data about American industry. They asked reasonable questions and performed detailed analysis, and they reached completely wrong conclusions because they could not imagine an alternative approach to tank production that did not follow German methods. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Understanding an adversary requires more than collecting information about their capabilities. It requires understanding how they think, how they organize, and how their assumptions might differ from your own. The Germans knew what American factories could do. They failed to understand how American factories actually worked, and that failure cost them the war. The specific numbers reveal the magnitude of the intelligence failure with precision. In May 1942, German intelligence estimated the total American tank inventory in all theaters at approximately 2,500 operational vehicles. This estimate was used for strategic planning throughout the summer and fall of 1942. The actual American tank strength as of December 1942 was over 8,000 operational tanks, with an additional 4,000 in training units or in transit to operational theaters. German intelligence had underestimated American tank strength by a factor of more than 3 to 1, and the gap was widening every month. By June 1943, German intelligence revised its estimates upward based on observed deployments in North Africa and growing reports from multiple sources. The new estimate placed American tank strength at approximately 6,000 vehicles. The actual number was over 15,000. The gap had widened despite German attempts to update their analysis. The revision process itself revealed the depth of the analytical failure. German intelligence officers looked at observed deployments, counted tanks seen in Sicily, North Africa, and training photographs, and extrapolated from those observations to estimate total production. This seemed like sound methodology, but it systematically underestimated actual production because it assumed observed deployments represented a large fraction of total American strength. In reality, observed deployments represented perhaps 20% of total American production. For every tank the Germans counted in combat zones, 4 more were in training units, depot storage, or in transit. The Americans maintained enormous reserves that German intelligence never detected because those reserves were not deployed forward where German reconnaissance could observe them. The reserve system itself reflected fundamental differences in American and German approaches to armored warfare. Germany deployed tanks as soon as they were available because every tank was needed at the front. Units operated continuously until destroyed or rendered inoperative by mechanical failure. There were no strategic reserves because Germany lacked the production capacity to build reserve forces. America maintained massive reserve formations because American production exceeded immediate deployment needs. Tank battalions rotated out of combat for refit and training. Replacement tanks arrived before units even requested them. Entire armored divisions remained in the United States for months of training before deployment overseas. This was possible only because American factories produced tanks faster than combat could destroy them. German intelligence observed American units arriving in Europe and assumed those units represented America's maximum deployment capability. They calculated that America must be straining to maintain forces already committed and would struggle to replace combat losses. This assumption guided German operational planning throughout 1943 and 44. The assumption was backwards. American deployment rates were constrained not by production capacity, but by shipping capacity and training requirements. The United States could have built twice as many tanks, but could not have shipped them to Europe or trained enough crews to operate them. The limiting factor was logistics and personnel, not industrial production. This distinction mattered because it meant American production could respond quickly to any increase in demand. When the Normandy invasion required massive armored forces, American factories increased production, and those tanks arrived in Europe within weeks. When the Battle of the Bulge created emergency equipment needs, reserve tanks in England and France were rushed forward, while factories accelerated production to rebuild reserves. Germany had no comparable flexibility. German tank production was already at maximum capacity. When combat created emergency needs, Germany had no reserves to draw upon and no way to increase production on short notice. German units destroyed in the Ardennes could not be rebuilt because the tanks did not exist and could not be manufactured fast enough to matter. The production differential became even more pronounced in early 1945 as Allied bombing systematically destroyed German industrial capacity. American factories continued operating at full capacity, producing over 2,000 tanks per month through May 1945. German production collapsed to fewer than 200 tanks per month by March and effectively ceased by April as factories were overrun or abandoned. The final American tank production total from December 1941 through August 1945 was 88,636 tanks. This included 49,234 M4 Sherman medium tanks, 24,000 light tanks of various models, over 2,000 M26 Pershing heavy tanks, and thousands of specialized variants. German tank production from 1940 through 1945 totaled approximately 27,000 tanks and assault guns. Adding Italian production of approximately 11,000 tanks and limited Hungarian and Romanian production brings total Axis tank production to roughly 40,000 vehicles. The Americans alone built more than twice as many tanks as the entire Axis alliance combined. When British, Canadian, and Soviet production is included, the Allies produced over 200,000 tanks compared to 40,000 Axis tanks, a ratio of 5-1. These production figures were available to German intelligence through multiple sources during the war. Allied press reports publicized major production milestones. Captured documents revealed production schedules. Prisoner interrogations confirmed factory locations and output rates. The information was there. German intelligence simply could not accept that the numbers were real. The psychological barrier to accepting the data was rooted in German assumptions about industrial capability and military culture. German engineering emphasized quality over quantity. German military doctrine valued superior equipment operated by highly trained crews. The entire German approach to armored warfare rested on the assumption that better tanks operated by better crews would defeat numerically superior but individually inferior forces. This assumption had worked in Poland, France, and early operations in Russia. German tanks were generally superior to Polish and French armor. German crews were better trained and more experienced. Superior quality and training overcame numerical disadvantage. The pattern reinforced German confidence in their approach. But the assumption stopped working when Germany faced an enemy that had both quantity and adequate quality. American tanks were not superior to German tanks in individual combat, but they were good enough, reliable enough, and numerous enough to overwhelm German forces through sheer mass. The Sherman tank had significant weaknesses compared to German Panthers and Tigers. Its armor was thinner, its gun was less powerful, Its profile was higher, making it easier to spot and hit. American tankers knew these disadvantages and complained about them throughout the war, but the Sherman had advantages that mattered more in sustained operations. It was mechanically reliable, requiring less maintenance than German tanks. It had excellent automotive performance, moving faster and farther on a tank of fuel than comparable German vehicles. It could be repaired quickly using standard tools and replacement parts that were widely available. And most importantly, destroyed Shermans were replaced within days, while destroyed Panthers might never be replaced. American armor doctrine emphasized these advantages. Tank units operated in mass formations that overwhelmed German defenses through concentration of force. When individual tanks were lost, other tanks in the formation continued the attack. Tank. Battalions rotated out of combat regularly for maintenance and refitting. Replacement tanks and crews joined units continuously, maintaining combat strength. German armor doctrine could not adapt to this approach because German tank availability never supported mass operations with depth and reserves. German armored formations operated at partial strength throughout most of the war. A nominally full-strength Panzer division might have 60 tanks instead of the 150 authorized. Replacement tanks arrived sporadically, if at all. Crews often operated vehicles that were partially broken, conserving operational tanks for critical missions. The contrast was stark during major operations. American armored divisions attacked with all 3 tank battalions simultaneously, supported by armored infantry, artillery, and close air support. German panzer divisions attacked with whatever tanks were operational that day, often fewer than 50 vehicles across the entire division. The Battle of the Bulge illustrated this disparity with brutal clarity. Germany's offensive employed 1,400 tanks and assault guns gathered from across the entire Western Front. This was Germany's last major armored reserve, assembled through months of careful husbanding of resources. The Americans deployed 9 armored divisions, plus 17 separate tank battalions, and 25 tank destroyer battalions to counter the offensive. This represented over 10,000 armored fighting vehicles, and these forces were deployed while American armored units continued operations in Italy, maintained forces along the Rhine, and kept reserve divisions in England. 10,000 tanks versus 1,400. The numbers tell the story of industrial warfare. Germany committed everything available to the offensive. The Americans responded with a small fraction of their total armored strength and still achieved over 7-to-1 numerical superiority in the battle sector. German commanders who participated in the Ardennes offensive later stated that the battle was lost before it began because German intelligence had failed to recognize American tank strength. They had expected to face perhaps 2 or 3 American armored divisions with 300 to 400 tanks total. Instead, they encountered continuous streams of American armor that seemed endless. General Hasso von Manteuffel commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the offensive. In post-war interrogations, he stated that the attack achieved initial success because surprise overwhelmed unprepared American infantry divisions. But as soon as American armor arrived in force, the offensive stalled because German tank strength was insufficient to overcome American numerical superiority. Manteuffel's forces included the Panzer Lehr Division, 2nd Panzer Division, and elements of several other armoured formations, perhaps 400 tanks at full strength. These units faced elements of the 4th, 6th, 10th, and 11th, armoured divisions plus separate tank battalions, over 2,500 American tanks in Manteuffel's sector alone. The mathematical impossibility of the situation was obvious to German commanders on the ground, but had apparently not been obvious to German intelligence officers planning the operation. The offensive plan assumed American armor could be defeated through surprise, aggressive tactics, and superior German tank performance. The plan did not account for the possibility that Americans would deploy tanks in such overwhelming numbers that tactical skill became irrelevant. German tank crews in the Ardennes reported engaging American formations that simply overwhelmed defensive positions through mass. One Panther could defeat 3 or 4 Shermans in a direct engagement, but when 10 Shermans attacked simultaneously from multiple directions, the Panther was destroyed, and more Shermans always followed. German after-action reports describe a battle of attrition that Germany could not win. Every German tank destroyed was a permanent loss. Every American tank destroyed was replaced within a week. German fuel shortages limited tank operations to a few hours per day. American tanks operated continuously because fuel was always available. German tanks often were abandoned due to mechanical failures that could not be repaired because spare parts were unavailable. American tanks were repaired in the field using abundant supplies of replacement parts. The Ardennes offensive destroyed German armoured capability in the West. By early February 1945, German forces on the Western Front possessed fewer than 200 operational tanks facing thousands of American and British vehicles. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated settlement instead eliminated Germany's last significant armoured reserve and ensured the final defeat would come within months. Hitler's strategic gamble in the Ardennes rested on faulty intelligence about American capabilities. German planning assumed American forces were overextended and could be defeated through one decisive blow. This assumption required believing that American tank strength was limited, that American logistics were vulnerable, and that American forces lacked the depth to respond effectively to surprise attack. Every assumption was wrong. American tank strength was effectively unlimited from a German perspective. American logistics could support operations at levels Germany could not match. American forces had enormous depth with reserve divisions that could be committed to battle at will. The intelligence failure was so complete that German planning was divorced from reality. Albert Speer, reviewing German intelligence assessments after the war, wrote that the most damaging intelligence failure of the war was the systematic underestimation of American industrial production. German strategic planning proceeded on. Assumptions about American weakness that were contradicted by readily available data. The failure was not collecting information, but accepting information that contradicted preferred beliefs. Speer noted that Hitler personally rejected intelligence reports showing high American production figures, calling them Allied propaganda designed to demoralize Germany. When intelligence officers attempted to revise upward estimates of American capacity, they were told the new estimates were defeatist and unrealistic. The institutional culture punished accurate analysis and rewarded analysis that supported leadership preferences. The result was strategic planning based on fantasy. Germany entered war with the United States, believing America lacked the industrial capacity, military tradition, and national will to wage total war. German planners thought America could be defeated through submarine warfare that would cut off supplies to Britain, leaving the United States unable to project power across the Atlantic. This strategic concept might have worked if American industrial capacity had been what German intelligence believed it to be. If America could only build 600 tanks per month, German U-boats could sink enough ships to prevent large-scale American deployment to Europe. If American war production was constrained by limited capacity, Germany could outlast American resolve. But American production was not constrained. America built tanks faster than Germany could build submarines to sink the ships carrying those tanks to Europe. America built ships faster than Germany could sink them. America built aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down. The entire German strategic concept of defeating America through attrition was doomed because American industrial capacity made attrition warfare suicidal for Germany. German intelligence possessed the data to understand this, but failed to analyze the data correctly. The failure was analytical and cultural, rather than empirical. German analysts looked at American society and saw what they expected to see: a soft civilian population, an inexperienced military, an industrial base oriented toward consumer goods rather than military hardware. They failed to understand that American industrial capacity was adaptable, scalable, and far larger than Germany's. American factories that built refrigerators could build tanks. American workers who assembled automobiles could assemble artillery. American engineers who designed consumer products could design military equipment. The skills transferred because American industry was based on standardized processes rather than specialized craft knowledge. This was the fundamental difference between American and German industrial culture that German intelligence never grasped. German industry emphasized specialized skill and technical excellence. American industry emphasized process efficiency and scalable production. Neither approach was inherently superior, but they had vastly different implications for wartime mobilization. Germany could build excellent tanks that were superior to American tanks in individual performance. But Germany could not scale production to match American output because German production methods did not scale efficiently. The craftsmanship that made German tanks excellent made them expensive, time-consuming, and dependent on skilled workers who could not be quickly trained or replaced. America built adequate tanks that were good enough for most combat situations. American production methods scaled efficiently because they relied on machines and processes rather than individual worker skill. The standardization that made American tanks less refined made them cheaper, faster to build, and producible by semi-skilled workers who could be trained in weeks. In industrial warfare, adequate quality at massive scale defeats superior quality at limited scale. This lesson should have been obvious from World War I, where Allied, numerical superiority eventually overwhelmed German tactical excellence. But German military culture in World War II remained focused on quality and tactical skill rather than industrial mass. The American approach to tank production reflected broader American cultural and economic characteristics. American industry had developed mass production methods through decades of civilian manufacturing experience. American workers were comfortable with specialized, repetitive tasks performed as part of large-scale production systems. American engineers designed for manufacturability rather than pure performance. These characteristics translated directly into military production advantages once war began. American factories did not need to learn new production methods. They applied existing methods to new products. American workers did not need extensive training in tank manufacturing. They applied familiar skills to unfamiliar products. American engineers did not need to develop revolutionary designs. They adapted existing technology using proven manufacturing techniques. The result was rapid mobilization at a scale Germany could not match. From nearly zero tank production in 1939, America reached monthly production rates exceeding 3,000 tanks by 1944. The entire production increase occurred in less than 5 years, a rate of expansion that German planners had thought impossible. German tank production increased during the same period, but never approached American levels. Germany started with higher base production in 1939 and had years of experience building tanks. Yet German peak production in 1944 was approximately 1,500 tanks per month, half the American rate despite Germany's head start and experience advantage. The production differential determined the war's outcome in the West. Once American tanks arrived in Europe in significant numbers, Germany could not prevent Allied advances through tactical excellence or superior equipment. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could replace losses faster and sustain operations longer. That side was America, supported by British and Canadian production that added thousands of additional tanks to Allied forces. The final German tank production figures for the war tell a story of industrial inadequacy. 27,000 tanks from 1940 through 1945, with production declining sharply in the final year as Allied bombing destroyed factories and resource shortages limited output. This was respectable production by historical standards, but completely inadequate compared to Allied output. Germany's fate was sealed not on the battlefield but in factories. American and Soviet factories outproduced German industry by margins that made victory inevitable once Allied forces could bring their material superiority to bear. Individual battles might be won or lost, based on tactics and leadership, but the war as a whole was determined by industrial capacity. The intelligence failure that failed to recognize American industrial potential was one of the most consequential mistakes of World War II. If German leadership had understood American production capacity, the entire course of the war might have been different. Not because Germany would have won, American entry likely made Allied victory inevitable, but because German strategy might have focused on negotiated settlement rather than total victory. But German intelligence delivered the assessments leadership wanted to hear rather than the assessments reality demanded. And so Germany fought a war of attrition against enemies with 3 times Germany's industrial capacity, believing until nearly the end that superior tactics and equipment could overcome numerical disadvantage. The American soldiers who fought in Sherman tanks never knew how close they came to facing much stronger German opposition, if German. Intelligence had accurately assessed American production, and German strategy had adapted accordingly. They knew only that when their tanks were destroyed, replacement tanks arrived quickly, and they continued fighting. For American tankers, the abundance of equipment was simply how their military operated. They did not realize that their enemy was fighting an entirely different war, where every loss was potentially irreplaceable, and where tactical decisions were constrained by equipment scarcity that American forces never experienced. The tank crews who fought through Europe from Normandy to Germany saw destroyed German tanks that were superior in armor and firepower to their own vehicles. Many questioned why American industry built Shermans instead of heavier tanks that could match German Panthers and Tigers on equal terms. The answer was that American strategy prioritized quantity over individual quality because American production capacity made quantity achievable at a scale that quality-focused production could never match. Build 90,000 adequate tanks instead of 30,000 excellent tanks, and the numerical advantage ensures victory even if individual vehicles are outmatched. This was not the American military tradition. American military culture valued quality and technological superiority, but American industrial culture valued efficiency and mass production. When the two cultures merged for World War II production, industrial culture dominated and shaped military procurement accordingly. The Sherman tank was the embodiment of this approach. Good enough for most combat situations, reliable enough to minimize maintenance, simple enough to build quickly, standardized enough to achieve massive production scale. It was not the best tank of the war, but it was the right tank for America's industrial warfare strategy. German intelligence never understood this strategic choice. German analysts looked at the Sherman and saw an inferior vehicle that confirmed their assumptions about American industrial inadequacy. They failed to see that the Sherman's design reflected deliberate choices about how to maximize total production rather than individual performance. By the time German intelligence recognized American tank production had reached levels Germany could never match, the war was already lost. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 was Germany's last attempt to achieve strategic victory through tactical excellence and surprise. The offensive failed because tactical excellence could not overcome 10-to-1 material disadvantage. Oberleutnant Franz Bäke, counting Sherman tanks rolling past his disabled Panther on the road to Bastogne, witnessed the collapse of German strategic assumptions in real time. The endless column of American tanks represented industrial capacity that German intelligence had consistently underestimated and that German strategy had failed to account for adequately. The story of American tank production in World War II is ultimately about industrial mobilization, strategic planning, and intelligence analysis. The industrial mobilization succeeded because American methods scaled efficiently. The strategic planning succeeded because American leadership understood their industrial advantages. The intelligence analysis succeeded because American planners accepted data even when it contradicted assumptions. German industrial mobilization was constrained by methods that did not scale efficiently. German strategic planning failed because leadership rejected intelligence that contradicted preferred beliefs. German intelligence analysis failed because the institutional culture punished accurate assessment of American capabilities. The difference determined who won the war. Not courage, not tactical skill, not individual equipment quality. Industrial capacity applied through sound strategy informed by accurate intelligence. America possessed all three. Germany lacked the last, two, and could not compensate through superiority in the first. The Americans built the tanks, 90,000 of them. The Germans counted 2,500 and planned accordingly. By the time German intelligence revised estimates to 15,000, America had already built 50,000. The war was over. The Germans just did not know it yet. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.